I'm Rob Butler. I'm the National Program Director here at the Green Festival, and I'm responsible for all... Osborne, can you hear this? Osborne, you want to turn it up? Good, good. I'm Rob Butler. I'm the National Program Director here at the Green Festival, and I'm responsible for all these great presentations and speakers that you see throughout this area. Thanks. So in addition to the great program here today, you should take a look at the schedule. We've got a complete lineup at all the other stages throughout the rest of the day. Osborne, can you hear it? Osborne, how about now? Now. Up. There you go. Hey, thank you. Social love. So thank you for coming today. You know why you're here, but in the meantime, the person that's going to do the introductions for us is here at Green Festival, Dr. Karina Basler, the president of Green Festival. Dr. Basler?
Thank you, Rob. Thank you. Once again, welcome everyone to the Green Festival here in Washington, D.C. This is a very, very special weekend because this is the 10th anniversary here having the Green Festival in Washington. Thank you. So for the people who are here the first time, Green Festival is America's largest green living and sustainability event. We bring together hundreds of brands, partners, sponsors, showcasing their green products. We cover everything. We have something for everyone, what's related to your green lifestyle. From food, from green living, fashion shows. We would like to make sure that you are empowered to bring a green offering to your life. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you. But also what's very important for us, next to our exciting partners, sponsors, and exhibitors, is to give back to the local communities. This is about empowering communities, and without our DC host committees, we could not make it happen. And also our wonderful audience and attendees. So please come to our Green Festival Community Award booth and vote for your famous local organization. Thank you so much. And now we're very, very happy to have Amy Goodman here giving us a very, very special presentation. I just had a little talk with Amy backstage, and it's just wonderful talking with her about sustainability and the green movement. And here in Washington, D.C. is one of the greenest cities here in the United States. And here's Washington as the capital of the United States. This is where really you can make a difference. This is where it starts to make sure that we have influence makers. Amy is the first journalist to receive the Right Livelihood Award, known as the Alternative Nobel Prize, for developing an innovative model of truly independent grassroots political journalism that brings to millions of people the alternative voices that are often excluded of the mainstream media. Amy's fifth book, The Silent Majority, Stories of Uprisings, Occupations, Resistance, and Hope, rose to number 11 of the New York Times bestseller list. Amy has received the American Woman in Radio and Television Gracie Award, and also the George Polk Award, the Robert Kennedy Prize for International Reporting. And now let me welcome you, Amy, and I would like everyone to know that after the speech, Amy is welcoming you to the bookstore where you have the chance to get a signed book from her. Thank you so much, and Amy,
this Green Fest in Washington, D.C. So important to have a Green Fest in the power capital of the world. I also want to thank Jamie Hill, who is here. She's over there. If you have any questions about Democracy Now! And all of our volunteers, she's running the Democracy Now! Booth, where you can get all sorts of t-shirts and bags, and most importantly, a wonderful way to support Democracy Now! I just came from doing a fundraiser for WHUT PBS. It's the only PBS station in the country that is owned by an HBCU, a historically black college. And Democracy Now! Airs, so you all have your flyers. I hope you take gobs of them and just pass them around to friends, leave them in coffee shops. It shows all the places Democracy Now! Broadcasts in the DC area. WHUT-TV, channel 32.1 and 32.2, every evening at 6. They also are now running it at 10 o'clock in the evening and at 2 in the morning. And of course, WPFW, 89.3 FM, where it all began 18 years ago on community radio. 89.3 every morning, Monday through Friday, 8 to 9 in the morning. And since I was just pitching on WPFW for the last many weeks, I hope you make your contribution to ensure that Pacifica Radio continues here in Washington, D.C. You know, I originally come from Pacifica Radio, which was founded in 1949 in the Bay Area in Berkeley, California, by a war resister named Lou Hill. He came out of the detention camps and said there has to be a media outlet not run by corporations that profit from war, but run by journalists and artists. And that's how the first Pacifica station, KPFA, went on the air in 1949. In 1959, KPFK in Los Angeles. 1960, my station in New York, WBAI. 1970, KPFT went on the air. And then in 1977, WPFW rounded out the 5 Pacifica stations. KPFT went on the air 44 years ago, 1970, and it's the only radio station in the country whose transmitter was blown up. It was in the first weeks of operation. The Ku Klux Klan strapped dynamite to the base of the transmitter and blew it to smithereens. It took a few weeks. They rebuilt the transmitter. They started broadcasting once again. And then the Klan strapped dynamite to the base of the transmitter, 5 times more powerful than the first explosion, and blew it up again right in the middle of Arlo Guthrie singing Alice's Restaurant. So now this was becoming a national event. The problem with engaging in terrorist acts like this, you know, it's not like Pacifica had money for advertising, and these explosions certainly blew KPFT into the consciousness of the potential listening audience of the people of Houston. Now when they got back on their feet after months off the air, PBS was there to broadcast KPFT going back on the air, and Arlo Guthrie came into town to finish singing Alice's Restaurant. I can't remember if it was the Grand Dragon or the Exalted Cyclops who took responsibility for this act, because I often confuse their titles. But he said it was his proudest act. I think because he understood how dangerous Pacifica is, how dangerous independent media is, dangerous because it allows people to speak for themselves. And when you hear someone speaking from their own experience, whether it's a Palestinian child or an Israeli grandmother or an uncle in Afghanistan or a woman in Yemen, it changes you. You come to understand them just a little bit more. I didn't say agree necessarily. How often do we agree with our family members when we're having a conversation? But you find common ground. And I think that's the beginning of peace. I think the media can be the greatest force for peace on earth. Instead, it is all too often wielded as a weapon of war. You can hear, for example, Maya Angelou speaking in her own words. And I come to you today at a time when just a few days ago, the great poet, writer, and activist, Maya Angelou, died. I write a column every week with my colleague Dennis Moynihan, and I'll be signing the column book afterwards. We call the book The Silenced Majority, because I really do think that those who are concerned about war and peace, those who are concerned about the growing inequality in this country, those who are concerned about climate change, which is why I think many of you are here today at this Green Fest, those of you who are concerned about the fate of the planet, are not a fringe minority, not even a silent majority, but the silenced majority, silenced by the mainstream media, which is why we have to take the media back. But this week's column, we headlined Maya Angelou's Still She Rises. And we began and ended in her words, as we did on Democracy Now! This week. You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may tread me in the very dirt, but still like dust I'll rise. So wrote Maya Angelou in her famous poem, Still I Rise. She died this week at 86 at her home in North Carolina. In remembering Maya Angelou, it's important to understand her commitment to the struggle for equality, not just for herself or for women or for African Americans. She was committed to peace and justice for all. And although all of the media, wherever you turn, did remember Maya Angelou, what I fear they leave out is the activism part of her life. Maya wrote in her breathtaking first autobiography, I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings, if growing up is painful to the Southern black girl, being aware of her displacement is the rust on the razor that threatens the throat. This autobiography chronicles her childhood till the age of 17. Born Marguerite Ann Johnson in St. Louis, at the age of 7 or 8, she was raped by her mother's boyfriend. He would then be murdered. The entire trauma of this left her silent for 5 years, refusing to speak to anyone but her brother. This woman, who would later come to be known for her words, lived in silence for 5 years. She became a single mother at 17, struggled to support her son as she worked a variety of jobs, and would later become a calypso singer. She heard Martin Luther King Jr. address the Harlem Writers Guild. She was the first female member of that guild. She joined with a fellow performer to produce and sing in Cabaret for Freedom in Greenwich Village to raise money for King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference. By some accounts it was King, or maybe it was Bayard Rustin, the great organizer. They asked her to take a leadership role in the SCLC, becoming the group's northern coordinator. She became a fierce supporter of Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution. I bet you didn't see that this week when you saw the remembrances of her. She fell in love with a South African civil rights activist. They moved to Cairo with her son. They stayed together for 3 years, but then she stayed in Africa, in Ghana. And it was there she met Malcolm X and helped him to form the Organization for Afro-American Unity. She wasn't often talked about this week in the same breath as Malcolm X. He was assassinated shortly after she returned to the United States. The tragedy of that assassination, as well as Dr. King's 3 years later, devastated Maya Angelou. In fact, her birthday was April 4th. And she refused to celebrate it for years because that was the same day in 1968 that Dr. King was assassinated. James Baldwin, among others, encouraged her to start writing down her life, which is how she began to write, and wrote I Know How, I Know Why, The Caged Bird Sings, the first of her 7 autobiographies. But she came to mainstream attention when she stood there on that inauguration day in 1993, the first inauguration of President Clinton, when she recited her poem for that day on the pulse of morning. While some schools and libraries continue to censor her work for her unflinching description of the reality of her life. My library, growing up in Bayshore, Long Island, New York, invited her when I was a young teenager to speak. My dad sat on the library board, and it was a great event. Maya Angelou was coming to town. She spoke at the local Catholic high school. Hundreds of us packed the place, and she didn't just speak. She sang, she danced, she rocked this auditorium. She made us gasp, cry, laugh, and she moved hundreds of us, black and white, together. She moved us together. That was her art, that was her talent. In commemorating Maya Angelou, none can speak as eloquently as she did herself about people who inspired her. At the Democratic National Convention in Boston in 2004, she spoke with Fannie Lou Hamer, who 40 years earlier had spoken at the Atlantic City Democratic Convention to try to seat the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. You remember 1964, or you might have read about it. This was the convention. We're not talking about the Republican convention, but the Democratic convention, where Fannie Lou Hamer and other civil rights activists say, no, we're not going to have a delegation from our state of Mississippi that is all white, as it has been since the beginning. We challenge this delegation. They should be unseated for an integrated delegation. Lyndon Johnson was not happy, and as Fannie Lou Hamer addressed the Rules Committee, Lyndon Johnson decided to give a speech in Washington over nothing, just so that, as he knew, the cameras would divert from her powerful address to him, saying nothing about anything. There was no breaking news at that moment, because he knew that the corporate media would act as a stenographer to those in power and focus on him instead of her, and he wasn't disappointed. But when Maya Angelou spoke at the Democratic Convention 40 years after Fannie Lou Hamer, she would say, in the most private part of the heart of every American lives a burning desire to belong to a great country, to represent a noble-minded country where the mighty do not always crush the weak, and the dream of democracy is not in the sole possession of the strong. Maya Angelou's tribute 2 years later to her dear friend Coretta Scott King could also be said of Angelou herself. She said she was a quintessential African-American woman born in the small-town repressive South, born of flesh and destined to become iron, born a cornflower and destined to become a steel magnolia. In eulogizing the actor and activist Ossie Davis in 2005 at his memorial service at the historic Riverside Church in Harlem, where Dr. King would give his anti-war speech, April 4th, 1967, a year to the day before he was assassinated. Maya Angelou remembered Ossie Davis with her poem. Again, her words of reflection on his death can serve as well as we note her passing. She said, when great trees fall, rocks on distant hills shudder. Lions hunker down in tall grasses, and even elephants lumber after safety. When great trees fall in forests, small things recoil into silence. Their senses are eroded beyond fear. Great souls die, and our reality bound to them takes leave of us. Maya Angelou's eloquence in her poetry will live beyond her flesh and blood. As she ended, "Still I rise," saying, "Out of the huts of history's shame I rise. Up from a past that's rooted in pain I rise. Bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave. I am the dream and the hope of the slave. I rise, I rise, I rise." Let us not forget the great Maya Angelou and all of her glorious artistry, prose, poetry, and activism. The media denigrates activism, but what can be more noble than dedicating your life to making the world a better place? I also remember today William Worthy. William Worthy, who was a fine journalist, a great pioneering journalist, who was former assistant to the Dean of Communications at Howard University, born, I think, in like 1921. As Jeremy Scahill, my colleague, who wrote Dirty Wars and Blackwater, The Rise of the World's Most Powerful Mercenary Army, said about William Worthy, "He's the most important journalist you'll never hear of." And it was through Jeremy that I met William Worthy. In fact, I met them at the same time. It was in 1997, and I had gone to cover Dorothy Day, who led the Catholic worker movement, the hospitality houses around the United States that welcome homeless people so that they can eat and sleep. She will one day be sainted. And I was doing a piece on Dorothy Day, so I went to the Catholic Worker House in New York. And as I walked in, this young man was in mid-sentence saying, "You got to interview this guy, you got to interview him, he's over there, it's very important." I said, "Wait a second, can you introduce yourself? What is your name?" He said, "That's not important, it's his name, William Worthy. You've got to interview William Worthy. He's in the corner, he's coming here to give a speech. You need to interview him." I said, "What's your name?" He said, "Well, my name is Jeremy Scahill." And that's how we met, and he came to be a producer at Democracy Now!, and we went to Nigeria together that summer to cover the oil corporation's exploitation in the Niger Delta. We did a documentary called Drilling and Killing, Chevron and Nigeria's Oil Dictatorship. And we looked at an area of Nigeria in the Niger Delta called Elijah Land, where the Nigerians were tired of yet another oil spill where Chevron was drilling. And so they went to the barge, the offshore barge, to demand that they speak with Chevron higher-ups to clean up their mangrove forests and offer the local people in what they call the host communities jobs. They stayed there until they saw Chevron helicopters, and they thought that they were flying in the negotiators, but instead they flew in Nigeria's military kill and go, the kill and go, the murderous police. And they landed on the Chevron barge where all the villagers were, and they opened fire, killing 2 of the Nigerian activists, critically wounding a 3rd, rounding up others and putting them into Nigerian jails where some of them were tortured. This was a story that Chevron, based in California, did not want you to know. When you protest in front of a stockholders meeting or Chevron headquarters, they can't open fire on you in the United States. But they rested sure that in Nigeria, in Africa's most populous country, that the corporate media in the United States would not shine a very bright light. And that's why it's our job to do this as journalists, to go to where the silence is. And so we brought back this story to the United States, and that was my first months working with Jeremy. But he said, interview this man. And so Juan Gonzalez and I interviewed William Worthy, and what a remarkable man he was. You might have seen his obituary in the last few weeks in the Washington Post or the almost full-page one in the New York Times. So why didn't you know about him when he was alive? William Worthy would go to the Soviet Union and to go to China, where he interviewed the first Chinese premier. The Secretary of State at the time, John Foster Dulles, did not appreciate an American journalist going to China. In fact, William Worthy was a Harvard Nieman Fellow at the time. And so when he came back to the United States and applied to renew his passport, the State Department wouldn't grant him a passport. It didn't stop him. He went to North Vietnam, he went to Cuba, he interviewed Fidel Castro. When he came back into the United States, they arrested him because they had revoked his passport. But the Supreme Court ultimately would overturn the conviction, saying you can't arrest an American citizen coming into this country because you have taken his passport and say he doesn't have a passport. He broke all of the rules of the corporate media. After the Iranian Revolution and the hostages were freed, he went to Iran. And there in the streets, Iranians were selling paperbacks of the documents they had taken from the U.S. Embassy after the revolution. And they were the documents that showed the U.S. complicity, the U.S. behind the 1953 overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh, the democratically elected leader of Iran. You know, it's an interesting story, just a side story. The person who forged this overthrow was Kermit Roosevelt, the nephew of Teddy Roosevelt, paid for by John Foster Dulles, right, the Secretary of State, and organized by John Foster Dulles and his brother Allen Dulles, who was the head of the CIA. So he overthrows Mossadegh, and then he comes back, and they were so happy with his work that they asked him to go down to Guatemala the following year to overthrow the democratically elected leader there, Arbenz. He refused and he retired, but they overthrew it anyway. John Foster Dulles was not only Secretary of State, but he was a corporate lawyer who represented United Fruit, for whom the U.S. overthrew the democratically elected leader because United Fruit wanted full reign and full power in Guatemala. But anyway, William Worthy broke many rules, and they were selling in the streets of Iran the books of the documents from the U.S. Embassy that told the story of the overthrow of 1953. All Iranians know 1953, that moment. In this country, we don't understand why people might be upset with the United States. That's why it's so important we have independent media to bridge the gaps. Not there for one state or another, but to be independent, to be the chronicler of the time, to hold those in power accountable. So these books that were freely available, he brought back into the United States, also freely available in Europe. And when he came into the airport, he made his way through, but he had sent another box of these books back to the United States, and they were taken by the authorities, and he was going to be arrested again for bringing these books into the country because they were forbidden books in the United States. The original Dan Ellsberg, he went to the New York Times, but they said they wouldn't publish them. And then he went to investigative reporter at the Washington Post, Scott Armstrong, who we had on Democracy Now!, and they published them on the front page of the Washington Post. And these documents were the beginning of the National Security Archive because they were so astounding. That was William Worthy. He would not stop, he would not curry favor, and he should be remembered by all. Just a few of the giants we've lost in the last few weeks. Also the great Vince Harding. Vincent Harding, last a professor at the Iliff School of Theology in Denver, wrote the draft of the speech that Dr. King gave April 4th, 1967, expressing his opposition to the war in Vietnam, when even his closest friends, King's closest friends, said, "Don't give this speech, Martin. You've got the President of the United States, Lyndon Johnson, wrapped around your finger. You got him to sign the Voting Rights Act. You got him to sign the Civil Rights Act. Don't antagonize him by taking on a war that's not yours. That's outside the civil rights movement. You're winning here at home. And so, Dr. King gave that speech anyway. He said, no, a war where our soldiers fight, a war that kills black and brown babies, is our war too. He saw it as a seamless web. And so Vince Harding sat in the basement of his house in Atlanta, Georgia, and he wrote this speech that Dr. King would then perfect and give at the Riverside Church, where he said, the country that he loved, the United States, is the greatest purveyor of violence on earth. Oh, the Washington Post, Life magazine, the New York Times, Time magazine, all castigated King. They said his speech sounded like propaganda from Radio Hanoi. They said he did a disservice to his cause and to his people. But King would not relent. And a year later, in Memphis, Tennessee, he would be gunned down. Which brings us back to the beginning of his public life in 1955, when he stood up in Montgomery, Alabama, for Rosa Parks. A great woman leader, Rosa Parks, who the media also covered in completely the wrong way. Right, Rosa Parks died a few years ago, and Democracy Now! Raced here to Washington. She was the first African-American woman to lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda. Then her body was brought to a Washington church before the big funeral in Detroit. And thousands came out to this church. Maybe some of you were there. And Oprah was inside, and Cicely Tyson was inside. We were outside, where it's often more interesting to be. There were big loudspeakers. And I interviewed a girl that morning. She was a college student. I said, what are you doing here? She said, oh, I emailed my professors. I said, I won't be in class today. I'm going to get an education. So how did the media get Rosa Parks' story wrong? I remember CNN, as we were heading down to Washington to cover this, saying Rosa Parks was a tired seamstress. She was no troublemaker. That's where they got it wrong. Rosa Parks was a tired seamstress, but she was a first-class troublemaker, too. She knew exactly what she was doing on December 1st, 1955. She didn't just sit down because she was tired. Yes, sick and tired. She had sat down on the bus before and refused to get up for a white passenger, as other young women had done. You never know when that magic moment will come. But if you're involved with social change, you will help to build a foundation that will determine the future, that will make history. She was the secretary of the local NAACP. She worked with Edie Nixon. He came out of radical labor politics. He was the president to challenge the racist laws of the South. She trained at the Highlander Center, black and white together, to most effectively strategize to change the laws of the South. You know, we also lost another great in these last few months, Pete Seeger, at the age of 94. Pete Seeger was on Democracy Now! A few months before he died, and he was telling the story of writing We Shall Overcome. It was really, he modified an old folk tune. It was We Will Overcome, but he felt you wanted to open your mouth, so We Shall Overcome. And he was perfecting it at the Highlander Center. And Dr. King came to the Highlander Center, and he heard Pete sing this song. And he left the Highlander Center, and he said to the person he was driving with, you know, that's a catchy tune. And it would later become the anthem of the civil rights movement. But December 1st, 1955, she sits down, Rosa Parks sits down on the bus, she gets arrested. 5 days later, December 5th, 1955, the Montgomery Improvement Association has its meeting to choose a leader to lead the bus boycott, and they choose a young minister who just come into town, Dr. Martin Luther King. Rosa Parks helped to launch Dr. Martin Luther King. She was a first-class activist. She was a world-class troublemaker. And to show how brave she was, just go back a few months to the summer of 1955, to the summer of Emmett Till. 14-year-old boy from Chicago, African American. His mother, Mamie, wanted him out of the city for the summer, sent him to be with family in Money, Mississippi. In the middle of the night, he's ripped out of bed by a white mob. He's beaten, tortured, and he ends up in the bottom of the Tallahatchie River. They said he wolf whistled at a white woman. Wolf whistled. Emmett was a stutterer, and his mother taught him, whenever you have trouble saying a word, whistle. They said he wolf whistled at a white woman. When his body was dredged up and sent back to Chicago, his mother, Mamie Till, was remarkably courageous. She said she wanted the casket open for the wake and the funeral. She wanted the world to see the ravages of racism, the brutality of bigotry. Thousands of people passed by his casket and saw. And then Jet Magazine and other black publications took photographs of his distended, mutilated 14-year-old head. And they were actually published. And they were seared into the history and consciousness of this country. Mamie Till had something very important to teach the press of today. Show the pictures. Show the images. Could you imagine for just 1 week if we saw the images of war everywhere? If every surviving newspaper above the fold had a story about a girl who died in Afghanistan, who knows how long our troops will stay. I know President Obama said it'll end at the end of 2016, but it was said before it would be at the end of 2014. Who knows? But if we saw the picture of a dead child on the cover, with her name told, her story told, if the head of every radio and television newscast in the United States for just 1 week told us of the story of a soldier dead and dying, if on everyone's Facebook wall or every tweet, every email that everyone sent out told us the story of perhaps a woman in Yemen, her family killed in a drone strike that the U.S. has escalated over these years. I really do think Americans are a compassionate people, that they would say, no, war is not the answer to conflict in the 21st century. But it's our job as journalists to get this information out, because if you don't know, how can you do something about it? And we need an independent press, which is why Edward Snowden and Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras are so important. Think about what it is that they did. Here's this young man, Edward Snowden, 29 years old, who rises in the ranks of the intelligence agencies. He worked for the CIA, he taught at the Defense Intelligence Agency College, he worked as a security guard over here at the University of Maryland College Park in a building that most think is University of Maryland, but in fact is in the NSA, the National Security Agency. And then he worked as a subcontractor. He worked at the CIA and for Booz Allen Hamilton for the NSA. And he was seeing things that were of deep concern to him as an American. How was it that he could read the email of the President of the United States? Shouldn't that be of concern to people? How was it he could learn about all of you as we carry around our NSA tracking devices and we actually pay for them? They don't pay us to carry around our bugs. We pay to carry them around. And he thought if Americans knew what was happening, we would stand up. But how does he get word out? So he left this country, but got in touch with American journalists, Barton Gelman of the Washington Post, Laura Poitras, independent filmmaker, and Glenn Greenwald, then of The Guardian. And Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras risked everything to meet him in Hong Kong. They didn't know if him was a her. They didn't know who this person was, in fact, if they were for real. They had no major institution behind them, but they understood the gravity of what it was he potentially had if this guy was for real. And he met them in Hong Kong. Glenn writes about it in his book, No Place to Hide, about the U.S. surveillance state and national security. And after questioning him vigorously for many hours, Glenn is a lawyer and a litigator, and he understood how to get at the truth and to assess as best he could whether this guy was the real deal. They started to release the documents. I mean, the media has misled us in so many ways, and you know, when he left Hong Kong, Snowden, and went to Russia, then the questions were asked, why would he go to Russia? Because he wanted to spy for the Russian authorities? He didn't want to go to Russia. He flew with the help of WikiLeaks, interestingly enough, and let's not forget Julian Assange is about to finish year 2 in political asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. Absolutely astounding that this guy has been held there for 2 years without charge. Sweden wants to question him, but doesn't even have enough evidence to charge him. Charging doesn't mean you're guilty, but it means there's somewhat enough evidence to charge. He has not been charged, Julian Assange. The U.S. government doesn't like him because of what he did in releasing the Iran war logs, the Afghan war logs, and the State Department cables for the last 40 or 50 years. And he helped Edward Snowden get a ticket to fly, hopefully he wanted to fly to Latin America to go into exile. But the U.S. pulled his passport when he left Hong Kong, so when he was in transit, stopped in the Moscow airport, he couldn't go anywhere because he didn't have a passport. So he ends up getting political asylum in Russia, not where he wants to be. But you think about what has been revealed from this. Now, President Obama has said this discussion, this global discussion we're having around surveillance is very important, but you shouldn't credit Edward Snowden with prompting this discussion, really. The U.S. government, James Clapper and others, as you know, lying repeatedly about the ability of the U.S. and what it was doing and spying on Americans, and not only Americans, but world leaders, allies, as well as U.S. government enemies. You know exactly who prompted this, and the fact that Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras risked everything to bring us this information is so important, and should be seen as a model for what journalists should do. My brother David and I wrote this book, Static, and we called it Static because, well, our first book is called The Exception to the Rulers, which is what all the media should be. It should not just be the motto of democracy now. We wrote Static because in this high-tech digital age with high-definition television and digital radio, all we ever get is static. That veil of distortion and lies and misrepresentations and half-truths that obscure reality. Well, what we need the media to give us is the dictionary definition of static: criticism, opposition, unwanted interference. We need a media that covers power, not covers for power. We need a media that is the fourth estate, not for the state. And we need a media that covers the movements that create static and make history. It is so important that you're here at Greenfest, that we reorient this economy, and that we engage in a sustainable way of living. You know, on the 3rd anniversary of the Fukushima catastrophe in Japan, just before it, we went and broadcast from Tokyo for 3 days. Because so often, when we talk about less reliance on oil, gas, and coal, and cover this movement around the country on college campuses, students and professors pushing for their university endowments to divest from the fossil fuel industry. The administration, particularly the Obama administration, more than any previous one, is pushing for nuclear power. I don't think that's what most Americans think of when they're talking about getting off our reliance on fossil fuels. Case in point is Fukushima and what happened 3 years ago, with a terrible earthquake that led to tsunami, that led to the meltdowns of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plants. And as I talk about nuclear power, I also want to remember another great who we lost in the last few weeks. And he was A.C. Byrd, the wonderful A.C. Byrd, who was very active at WPFW on the local and national boards of Pacifica Radio. And he was a leader of the Atomic Veterans Movement. In the 1950s, he was exposed to radiation by U.S. nuclear testing in the South Pacific. Well, that relates to what's happened now with nuclear power as the Obama administration pushes to build 2 new nuclear power plants in Georgia. No administration has succeeded in building nuclear power plants for more than 30 years because of the intense concern about nuclear power as a result of the 3 Mile Island meltdown and now what's happened at Fukushima. But the Obama administration is committed to, as Obama says, a nuclear renaissance, which brings us to climate change in Fukushima. I had the chance to interview while I was in Japan the former Prime Minister of Japan, Naoto Kan. He was the sitting Prime Minister at the time of the meltdown. As it was happening, he was totally pro-nuclear. He could not get information about what was happening at this plant that was some 50 miles from Tokyo. Would he have to evacuate 50 million people? Would Japan end as we know it today? He tried to get information from what's called TEPCO, the Tokyo Electric Power Company that owned the plants, but he said it was only propaganda. He could not get a straight answer. So what he decided to do was to fly to the plant where he thought the only place he could get a straight answer from the workers at the plant. And then he understood the magnitude of the catastrophe, and he completely made a 180-degree turn. The only sitting world leader to completely change his mind and now speaks again around the world against nuclear power. Says we cannot afford the possibility of what will happen when nuclear power plants melt down. This centralized form of very dangerous power. And now you have, remarkably enough, U.S. sailors and Marines who are suing TEPCO and Japan for their exposure during Fukushima. More than 100 U.S. Marines and Navy sailors have joined a class action suit charging TEPCO with lying about the severity of the disaster as they were rushing to the scene to provide humanitarian assistance. They were aboard the nuclear-powered aircraft carrier USS Ronald Reagan and other vessels traveling with the Reagan engaged in humanitarian response to the disaster. The response was dubbed Operation Tomodachi, meaning Operation Friendship. Lieutenant Steve Simmons was one of the plaintiffs. Before Fukushima, he was a robust man. 8 months later, he suffered inexplicable health problems. He said on Democracy Now! That while driving to work, I blacked out, drove my truck up on a curve. I started coming down with maybe what I thought was just the flu, then running fevers. I dropped 25 pounds, started experiencing night sweats. 3 days later, after he was hospitalized, he was discharged. He was back in the hospital, 103-degree fever. In April 2012, his legs buckled under him while he was hospitalized. He's been in a wheelchair ever since. And this was just the beginning of the descriptions of what happened to a number of sailors and Marines who thought they were coming to help the Japanese, which they were, but what they experienced, the collateral damage. It is absolutely critical that we look at climate change in a comprehensive, systematic way and change our lifestyle to be sustainable. Humans are baking the planet. The majority of the world is convinced that humans are changing changing the climate for the worse, but here in this country. Because fossil fuel companies front think tanks, what many call stink tanks, and they pour millions of dollars to produce. They know they can't deny climate change is happening. Forget what's happening in the rest of the world. Look at the forest fires here. Look at Superstorm Sandy. Look at California in an unprecedented drought. All of this seems disconnected. And if you watch corporate networks, you might think it is. You have these meteorologists that people tune into, continually flashing the words extreme weather, severe weather, which they should. And it's why many people tune into television to find out what the weather will be. It's so unpredictable now. But they've got to flash another two words, and that is climate disruption, global warming. It's not just about what you should wear that day. You know, a winter coat one day and a bikini the next. It's about what we can do about it to save our planet. And there is so much that we can do about it. You know, the IPCC, the Nobel Prize-winning Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has issued its latest report. Rajendra Pachauri said if the world doesn't do anything about mitigating the emissions of greenhouse gases and the extent of climate change continues to increase, then the very social stability of social systems could be at stake. The latest report says climate change can indirectly increase risks of violent conflicts in the form of civil war and intergroup violence. Even the Pentagon admits that this is the greatest threat in the 21st century. Climate refugees causing wars, hunger caused by a baking planet. It is absolutely critical that we take this seriously. I wanted to read the words of a remarkable young woman as I wrap up this talk. You know, Democracy Now! Has covered the climate change summits from Copenhagen in 2009 to Cancun in Mexico to Durban, South Africa, to Doha in Qatar, to this year we were in Warsaw, Poland, a few years ago also at the People's Summit in Bolivia, all around climate change. Now you might wonder, as I speak and look up this report at the same time, we'll see if I can speak and do a search at the same time. And if I were chewing gum, if I could do all three at once. But I think I can do this. No. Don't you love how the words change when you put them into a search and you say something that you thought and you come up with something very different? Okay, don't change it, don't change it. I mean what I write. Have you ever written something like to someone very quickly, you shoot off a text like, that's difficult, D-I-F-T, or that's different, and they get it, and you're on to something else, and then you look down and say, well, you know, F you too, and you look down and you go, what? I just said, that's different what you wrote, and you realize you wrote to them, that's dirt, because your phone, your smartphone thought it was too smart for its own good. I found Dear Anjali's speech. Okay. So we've gone to all these climate summits, and you might wonder, why do we change? Why do we even use the fuel to go to these UN summits if we care about climate change? Because nothing gets accomplished at them. The reason we go and bring you a week of programming every year on climate change alone, and then of course cover it for the rest of the year, is because though nothing gets done inside, thousands of people come from across the planet who are suffering the direct effects of climate change, and what happens inside and what happens out outside with these gatherings, even when people get thrown out of the summit, get arrested, get thrown out of the country and deported, their words are important. So when we were in Durban, South Africa, at the end of the summit, a young woman named Anjali Padurai from College of the Atlantic, where you get a degree in human ecology in Bar Harbor, Maine, got up to address the summit. She was actually invited, and I wanted to end by sharing her words. She said, "I speak for more than half the world's population. We are the silent majority. You've given us a seat in this hall, but our interests are not on the table. What does it take to get a stake in this game? Lobbyists, corporate influence, money? You've been negotiating all of my life. In that time, you've failed to meet pledges, you've missed targets, and you've broken promises. But you've heard this all before. We're in Africa, home to communities on the front line of climate change. The world's poorest countries need funding for adaptation now. The Horn of Africa and those nearby in Kwamashu needed it yesterday. But as 2012 dawns, our Green Climate Fund remains empty. The International Energy Agency tells us we have 5 years until the window to avoid irreversible climate change closes. The science tells us we have 5 years maximum. You're saying give us 10. The most stark betrayal of your generation's responsibility to ours is that you call this ambition. Where is the courage in these rooms? Now is not the time for incremental action. In the long run, these will be seen as the defining moments of an era in which narrow self-interest prevailed over science, reason, and common compassion. There is real ambition in this room, Anjali said, but it's been dismissed as radical, deemed not politically possible. Stand with Africa. Long-term thinking is not radical. What's radical is to completely alter the planet's climate, to betray the future of my generation, and to condemn millions to death by climate change. What's radical is to write off the fact that change is within our reach. She said 2011 was the year in which the silent majority found their voice, the year when the bottom shook the top. 2011 was the year when the radical became reality. She ended by saying, respect the foundational principles of this convention. Respect the integral values of humanity. Respect the future of your descendants. Mandela said it always seems impossible until it's done. So distinguished delegates and governments around the world, governments of the developed world, deep cuts now. Get it done. And as she left the stage, followed by hundreds of young people as she walked out of the room, the chairperson of the UN Climate Change Summit in Durban, South Africa said, "Thank you, Ms. Padurai," who was speaking on behalf of half the world's population, I think she said at the beginning. And on a purely personal note, said the speaker, said the chair of the whole UN Climate Summit, "I wonder why we let not speak half the world's population first in this conference, but only last." The next year, I would interview Anjali at the next UN Climate Summit. But I had to talk to her outside the summit because she had been banned from attending the next summit. This is why Democracy Now! Is so important. We bring you the words of people that are banned, maybe today, but will be considered prophets tomorrow. And so as I leave you, value the stations, the independent media outlets that bring you Democracy Now! And so many other programs. Support WPFW Pacifica Radio. Support WHUT. Support your community public outlets. And finally, fight for a free and open internet. The telecoms and the cable companies want to rewrite the rules of the internet, and sadly, they have accomplices at the FCC. Tom Wheeler is now the head of the Federal Communications Commission, appointed by President Obama, who, when he was running for president, Senator Obama said he absolutely supported an open and free internet, and then appoints Tom Wheeler, who's the former head lobbyist for the cable industry. He was the head of the NCTA, the National Cable and Telecommunications Association. I might have the name not exactly right. And now he's the head of the FCC. Michael Powell, the former head of the FCC, the son of General Colin Powell, is now the head of the NCTA. They have switched places, but are doing the same job, closing down this form of communication that is absolutely critical to grassroots globalization all over the planet. We must all fight in this time of a public debate where the FCC is weighing public internet, that the rules not be changed to allow a two-tiered system. Now, what do we mean when we talk about network neutrality? When you call someone on the phone, just because they might be poorer than you, their phone does not have a lot of static, right? Because we have common carrier rules. The phones all over the country are supposed to be equal. If you're poorer, you're not supposed to be driving on inferior roads while others drive on fancy highways. If the internet is considered a common carrier, a kind of public utility, it will be protected. But if it is privatized, it becomes the private property of the wealthiest corporations on the planet. So when you go to google.com, it'll come right up. When you go to democracynow.org, we might not have enough money to keep it up the way google.com will pay, and so it might take you 10 minutes. And that there's this Dalit women's website in India, an untouchable website, you might not ever see it at all. That is not acceptable. The internet was built with public money, and now that it is so incredibly valuable, the corporations cannot take hold of it and make it their private property. It is the critical form of communication for all of us as we globalize with people all over the globe. It is the critical battle for understanding and peace around the world today, and it starts right here in Washington. As I always say, and I will repeat, I see the media and the internet as a huge kitchen table that stretches across the globe, that we all sit around and debate and discuss the most important issues of the day. War and peace, life and death. And anything less than that is a disservice to a democratic society. Keep the internet open and free. Support public media. Thank you for coming to Greenfest. Democracy Now!